Why was she even standing in that line? 20 of the military's best long-range marksmen stood shoulder to shoulder under a brutal western sun. Most bore the quiet, stone-carved faces of men who had stared through scopes in combat zones, half a world away. They had sand in their memories, dust in their blood, and a weight in their eyes only deployments could bring. And then there was her, Avery Mitchell, 5'7", lean frame, the red hair hidden under a regulation helmet still managing to hint at its fire. She stood at the far end of the row, rifle case by her boots. Posture as rigid as anyone else's, yet she might as well have been standing on a different planet. To her left, Sergeant Reynolds glanced down the line, his mouth curling into something between a grin and a sneer. "Well, would you look at that?" he said loudly enough for the entire formation to hear. "Command sent us their office mascot. Guess they needed to fill a quota." The chuckle he let out wasn't just his. A few joined in, the kind of laugh that isn't about humor at all, but about making sure someone knows where they stand. No one corrected him in a place like this. Rank, reputation, and history add their own gravity. Reynolds, with his chest full of ribbons and 3 tours etched into his posture, was a planet all his own. Avery didn't so much as flinch. No flicker of her eyes, no tightening of her mouth, but beneath the stillness, in the tight, quiet space of her own mind, she filed the moment away. She'd been here before, not here on this range, but in this place where people measured you against an assumption. The Sniper Ridge training facility stretched for 50 square miles of the most unforgiving terrain the western United States had to offer. Here, heat shimmered off cracked earth by day, and cold bit at bone by night. The wind was a living thing, unpredictable and hostile. Standard ballistic charts were almost useless here. This was where the military's most elite came to prove they could hit the impossible or go home carrying the sting of failure. Commander Hayes strode to the front. He was a tall man, the years of service evident in every line of his weathered face. He had the kind of presence that made conversations falter when he entered a room. His voice cut through the heat. "Ladies and gentlemen." The pause was deliberate. His eyes passed over the row until they landed on Avery. "Welcome to final qualification day. By sunset, most of you will fail. A select few will pass. And maybe, 1 or 2 will impress me." The air seemed to tighten. Hayes' reputation was legend. The kind earned not from stories, but from the whispers of those who'd been there. It was said he had made shots beyond what doctrine claimed was possible. And here he was, setting the tone with a simple truth. Failure wasn't an option. It was an expectation, as he outlined the day's trials. Distances, conditions, scoring. Avery stood still, her breathing measured. Behind her, Reynolds leaned closer again, voice just for her. "This is where your little adventure ends, Princess." She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. The only sign she'd heard was the faintest tightening of her jaw. What Reynolds didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Avery Mitchell had come here for reasons none of them could imagine. And while he saw a rookie clinging to the fringes of a unit she didn't deserve to be in, she saw something else entirely. A test she was ready for. From a shaded rise some distance away, Captain Wilson observed, unlike the others, he had read her file from start to finish. He knew that beneath the plain issue rifle case and quiet posture was something the rest of them couldn't begin to measure. And while they were busy dismissing her, he was quietly waiting. The morning bled into the ritual of rifle checks and equipment inspections. Avery knelt by her XMC rifle, the matte finish catching the sunlight. It was a precision system worth more than most cars, a tool that in the right hands could reach across miles. Her hands moved over it with a surgeon's precision, checking scope clarity, confirming turret settings, aligning her ammunition into neat, perfect rows beside her. "You even know how to load that thing, sweetheart?" Davidson's voice, deep and dripping with a southern drawl, floated down the line. Laughter again. Avery didn't answer. She chambered her round, cycled the bolt, and ejected it. Checking the brass for the smallest imperfection, another voice joined. And from somewhere behind her, heard she's only here because General Monroe's niece needed a confidence boost. Participation trophy for the girls' team. Reynolds loomed over her now. Rifle looks factory standard. Mitchell, no mods, no personal touches. Guess that's fitting. It meets specifications, Sergeant, she said evenly, eyes still on her rifle. Barely meeting specs might cut it in your admin job, but this is the real military. This is where we separate warriors from wannabes. From the corner of her vision, Avery saw Captain Wilson approach. Sergeant Reynolds, Wilson said, tone clipped. Perhaps you could focus on your own weapon. Qualification begins in 20 minutes. Reynolds straightened, offered a stiff yes, sir, and stepped back, but his eyes lingered on Avery with the promise of more. Wilson crouched beside her, lowering his voice. How are you holding? Up, Mitchell? Fine, sir. She didn't look up. You know you could end this any time. One word from me and, with respect, sir, she interrupted, finally meeting his eyes with a gaze that was calm, green, and unwavering. I'd rather let my shooting speak for itself. Wilson studied her for a beat, then gave a small nod. As you wish. First targets at 800 meters. Standard conditions. Child's play, she murmured, so softly only he heard, when he walked away. She settled into a stillness that only grew as Commander Hayes called the group to the line. The first test began. 20 rifles on 20 targets. At the mark, the volley cracked through the air almost in unison. Avery's round found dead center. She didn't smile. She didn't look around for reactions. She simply cycled her bolt and made ready for whatever came next. Reynolds, watching her from down the line, scoffed. Anyone can hit at 800. Let's see her at real distance. And as if summoned by his doubt, Hayes announced the next challenge. 1,200 meters. Variable winds. The range flags flickered in conflicting directions, a tangle of invisible currents between shooter and target. Avery adjusted her scope with a precision that drew a glance from Reynolds. You're overcompensating, he said. But go ahead, miss by a mile. Her breathing slowed. She found the lull in the wind, squeezed the trigger, and watched the shot land. Dead center again. She didn't look at Reynolds. She didn't need to. The silence between them said enough. The sun climbed higher, spilling heat like molten metal over Sniper Ridge. The rain shimmered. Mirage waves blurred the horizon, distorting shapes, bending light in ways that could trick even a seasoned shooter's eye. The line of snipers reset. New distance, new variables. Targets at 1,500 meters now. Human silhouettes so small against the landscape that they seemed like ghosts. A gust of wind tugged in Avery's collar. She studied the flags downrange. They flared in different directions, each one a separate language of the air. Reynolds called it real distance. But in truth, this was still only mid-range for what she was capable of. She could feel the truth of it in her bones. The challenge hadn't arrived yet. 1,500, Hayes called. Wind shifting every 30 seconds. You'll need to adjust on instinct. The snipers went to work, wind meters in hand, scopes being dialed, math done on the fly. At this distance, even a 1 mile per hour miscalculation could mean a miss by feet. Avery didn't look at the others. She knelt, adjusted her bipod legs by exactly 1 click, flattened her chest against the earth, and let her breath come slow. Her first shot cracked. Through the scope, she watched the bullet's vapor trail dance in the turbulence, and then the round punched the target exactly where she had intended, again. She didn't react, didn't mark the hit with a smile down the line. Reynolds' first round went high left, nicking the target, but far from center mass. His second corrected, but only barely. He masked his irritation with a smirk in Avery's direction. Beginner's luck, he muttered. Just loud enough to carry. But that smirk didn't hide the way his shoulders stiffened when the next range was called. 1,800 meters. Now the targets were little more than specks against the valley beyond. The wind here was treacherous, a layered thing, slow at ground level, violent at mid-course, then strangely calm at the far end. It could turn. A perfect shot into a miss by the time the bullet arrived. One by one, shooters began to falter. Hits became fewer. Murmurs rose between shots, quiet curses, recalculations, and through it all, Avery's shots stayed true. Not just hits, perfect groupings. By the time Hayes inspected her target, his voice carried something new. Groupings unusually tight for these conditions, Mitchell. She nodded once, offering no further detail. From behind, Davidson's voice rose. Sir, maybe the wind died down for her. I felt it. Hayes' eyes cut toward him. The wind meters disagree, Davidson. Focus on your own shooting. The morning session ended with Avery holding a perfect record. That, in itself, was a problem. The range was a proving ground, not a place for anomalies, and yet, there she was, anomaly embodied. Lunch breaks scattered the team. Gear was cleaned, scopes wiped down. Quiet conversations bloomed in the shade of vehicles and sparse trees. Avery found a place alone, beneath a stunted desert tree that offered barely a hand's width of shade. She'd stripped her rifle down to its core, bolt, firing pin, chamber, each piece cleaned with deliberate care. Across the camp, Reynolds had gathered his circle. His voice carried, whether intentional or not. You know why they're pushing these diversity hires, right? He said, flicking his chin toward Avery. Politics, command checks a box, and real soldiers clean up the mess. A few men laughed. A couple looked away. Davidson leaned in. I heard she was personally recommended by someone high up. Reynolds gave a sharp bark of laughter. Yeah, on her back, probably. The laughter came again, but shorter this time, and it died altogether when Captain Wilson appeared. Sergeant Reynolds, he said, his voice cool as a blade's edge. Your accuracy last round was disappointing. Perhaps your time would be better spent on your weapon than your commentary. Yes, sir. Reynolds' posture snapped to attention, but his jaw flexed tight. Wilson moved on, crossing to Avery. He crouched beside her, eyes on the disassembled bolt. That's an interesting firing pin spring you've got there. Reduces lock time by about 1.2 milliseconds. She said without looking up. Matters at extreme distance. Most shooters wouldn't think to do that. Wilson said, I'm not most shooters. He studied her a moment. You could end this right now. You know, one word from me. That's not why I'm here, sir, she said, cutting him off gently. No, I suppose it isn't, he murmured. This afternoon. 2,000 meters plus. Winds forecast to worsen. I'll be ready. As he walked away, Wilson glanced over his shoulder. Your bolt carrier's immaculate. By the way, most spend twice the time to get it that clean. Avery said nothing, sliding the reassembled bolt home with a precise click. When the afternoon session began, the shift in atmosphere was tangible. The sun was dropping toward a horizon brushed with dark clouds. The wind had teeth now, sudden gusts from different directions, no rhythm to trust. Hayes' voice carried over the platform. 2,200 meters. Crosswind between 8 and 15 miles per hour. Barometric pressures dropping. Adjust accordingly, you get 3 attempts. Subtle exchange of glances passed along the line. 2,200 meters wasn't impossible, but in these conditions, it was close one by one. The shooters took their turns. Davidson missed all 3. Garcia managed a single hit on his 3rd attempt. Even the more seasoned snipers struggled, making contact only once in 3 shots. Reynolds stepped up, narrating his adjustments for the benefit of those behind him. First shot, miss. Second, clipped the target's edge. Third, a hit, but far from center. He stood and exhaled, clearly pleased with himself. That's how it's done. Let's see the rookie match that. Avery stepped forward, settled in. Her hands moved quickly over the adjustments, almost too quickly for anyone to follow. Reynolds, hovering close enough to taunt, leaned in. "Don't feel bad when you miss, Mitchell. Nobody expects you to actually hit at this range." She ignored him, focused instead on the rhythm of her own breathing, waited for the wind's brief surrender. Squeezed. The bullet took its long arc, seconds that felt like minutes, before finding the center of the target. Murmurs rose. Hayes checked the spotting scope, his face unreadable. Center mass, prosid. Second shot, perfect hit. The murmurs swelled. Reynolds' expression tightened. Third shot. Avery made a subtle adjustment that puzzled even the most experienced eyes. The wind hadn't shifted. The shot seemed unnecessary. But when the crack came, the round landed dead in the center. Tighter than the previous two. 3 for 3. Perfect placement. Hayes announced, and there was no hiding the note of surprise this time. Reynolds took a step forward. "Sir, I request verification of Mitchell's rifle." "Fair enough," Hayes said. "Mitchell, your weapon." She handed it over without hesitation. Hayes and Wilson examined it piece by piece. No illegal mods, no hidden tech. Just that firing pin spring Wilson had already noted. Completely within regs, Hayes confirmed. Reynolds wasn't satisfied. "Sir, with respect, a rookie with minimal field experience out shooting veterans? These distances?" "Your concerns are noted, Sergeant," Hayes said coldly. "But the results speak for themselves." And as they spoke, Wilson leaned toward Hayes with something else in mind. "Sir, I think it's time we skip ahead." By the time the call came to move, the sun was bleeding into the edges of the storm front. The convoy rolled to the far edge of the training grounds, where the earth dropped into a vast valley. From the raised platform there, you could just make out a silhouette on a distant hillside. So faint it barely existed, Hayes gestured toward it. 4,420 meters. That's your target. You'll get 3 attempts. I don't expect success. I'm more interested in your process." The air around the shooters seemed to change. They all knew the world record stood at 3,400 meters. This was nearly a full kilometer beyond it. And yet, when the order came to prepare, Avery didn't look at the target. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket, flipping it open to pages of complex equations no one else here would have recognized. She wasn't calculating like the others. She was building something entirely different, something Reynolds wouldn't understand until it was far too late. The wind out here had a voice. It hissed through the valley below, a whisper that rose and fell without warning, carrying the scent of distant rain. The desert floor stretched away in rolling waves of pale earth, falling into a basin that looked carved out by time itself. On the far side, so far it might as well have been another world, a hill rose, and on that hill, a silhouette barely larger than the thumbprint through a high-powered scope. That was the target, 4,420 meters away, even for the best in the world. The number didn't make sense. This was nearly a kilometer beyond what doctrine called maximum effective range. At this distance, bullets didn't just drop, they fell. The rotation of the earth itself began to matter. Hayes' voice cut the wind. In 5 years, only 2 people have made this shot. He let the words hang. Most of you won't come close. That's not the point. What I want to see is how you solve a problem the manual says can't be solved. The shooters spread out to prepare bipods. Dug into the platform, scopes were adjusted, then adjusted again. Notebooks opened to scroll data. Every face wore the same expression, a mix of doubt and determination. Reynolds was grinning. Being first meant one thing. He'd face the most stable conditions before the approaching storm front shifted the wind. Mitchell, shooting last, would face the worst of it. It wasn't just an advantage. It was the kind of luck he could wrap around himself like armor. Avery unpacked her gear without looking at him, without looking at anyone. She set her rifle on its rest. checked the bubble level, locked the bipod legs into position. Her movements were calm, methodical, almost slow. But in her eyes there was something sharper, a narrowing, as if she was shutting the world out. From her pocket, she pulled a small, weather-worn notebook. The pages were a forest of numbers and formulas, calculations so dense they looked more like something stolen from a physics lab than a sniper's field notes. She began writing, not the simple math every sniper here knew, but chains of variables strung together like code, air density shifts, crosswind shear at varying altitudes, light refraction through the humid air building ahead of the storm, spin, drift, the Coriolis effect, mapped precisely against the valley's slope. No one here, save perhaps Wilson, could have followed it. When she was done, she closed the notebook, set it aside, and took out something else. A compact electronic device she keyed in numbers. Watched the screen flicker, then slid the device back into her pocket. The call came. First shooter to the line. Reynolds stepped forward like he owned the ground. He lay prone, rifle settled into his shoulder, cheek weld perfect. His hands worked the adjustments with the confidence of muscle memory. His breathing steadied crack 9 long seconds later. The spotter's voice came over the radio. "Miss, 3 meters right." Reynolds' jaw tightened. He adjusted for wind. Crack. "Miss, high left, 1.8 meters. 1 more shot. Crack. Miss." Wide right. When he rose, there was a set stiffness to his shoulders. He turned toward the others. Conditions are shifting unpredictably. That's what's throwing it off. One by one, the rest of the snipers took their turns. Garcia, Davidson, the others. A few landed close enough that in combat, maybe the shot would have counted. But here, close was still a miss as the list dwindled. The air grew heavier. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was the sense that the challenge was living up to its name. Finally, only Avery remained. She stepped to the platform without ceremony. Rifle in hand, Reynolds' voice followed her like a shadow. "Don't feel bad when you miss, Mitchell. None of us could hit it." She didn't even turn her head, laying prone. She placed the rifle into position, checked her level, and brought the scope to her eye. But instead of firing, she reached for her pocket, pulling out the small electronic device again. She keyed in fresh data, made notes in her book, then dialed her scope with a series of adjustments that made no sense to the onlookers. "Those corrections are insane," Davidson whispered to Garcia. "She's guessing," Reynolds muttered. But it wasn't guessing. Every adjustment was exact. Every click of the turret was an answer to a calculation no one else had the tools to make. Hayes stepped closer. "You have 3 attempts, Mitchell." "Take your time." Avery's voice was low. "I'll only need 1. Heads turned. Reynolds actually laughed. The confidence of the clueless. Avery ignored him. She exhaled fully, inhaled half a breath. Let her heart beat slow until it felt like the world's pulse had matched her own. Through the scope, she saw not just the target, but the air between, a shifting, living barrier she had already mapped in her mind. She squeezed. The rifle bucked. Against her shoulder, the sound sharp in the still air. And then, the wait. 9 seconds. 9 seconds in which the bullet traveled more than 4 kilometers. 9 seconds in which the air twisted and warped its path. Silence. Then the radio crackled. Direct hit, center mass. The spotter's voice carried something unsteady, as beer. If even speaking it aloud felt impossible. Repeat, perfect center mass. For a moment, no one moved. The range was silent except for the wind. Reynolds broke first. No, that's impossible. She must have... No mistake, Captain Wilson said, stepping forward. Just mathematics. Applied perfectly. All eyes were on her now, Avery. Was already breaking down her rifle, tucking it into its case. No celebration, no reaction. Hayes' gaze was fixed on her. "Mitchell, methodology." She looked up. 13 variables, sir. Standard ballistics, wind speed, direction, temperature, humidity, plus barometric pressure gradient across the valley. Light refraction from the storm front, spin drift, Coriolis effect, and curvature of the Earth. The shot's flight path wasn't a straight line. I mapped the curve. Her voice was flat, factual, almost clinical, but there was an undercurrent. There, not arrogance, certainty. The explanation landed like a stone in water. Ripples of realization passed through the group. This wasn't luck. It wasn't even talent in the traditional sense. This was mastery. Hayes' eyes narrowed. That level of calculation isn't standard sniper training. No, sir, Avery said simply. Reynolds, desperate, interjected. We need to verify the target physically. Hayes nodded once. Fair enough, Wilson. Take Reynolds. Confirm. The Humvee roared off toward the far hillside. The others stayed where they were. Circling Avery now, Garcia's voice was hesitant. How'd you calculate the mid-valley wind variance? That's what killed my shot. I didn't guess. She said, pulling her notebook free again. Wind follows patterns, terrain, temperature shifts. If you map them properly. Davidson leaned in, staring at the pages. This isn't sniper math. This is physics. Ballistics is just applied physics, she said, and began packing the book away again. 20 minutes later, the Humvee returned. Reynolds climbed out. Slowly, his expression stripped of the bravado that had marked him all day. Captain Wilson followed, a small smile on his face. Confirmed, Wilson said. Perfect center mass, one shot. There was no denying it now. Avery Mitchell had done what they believed couldn't be done. Hayes was still watching her, studying the composure, the lack of celebration. Finally, he said, I think it's time you tell us who you really are. She let the silence stretch before answering. Then, a small, almost private smile. Captain Avery Mitchell, sir, Ph.D. in applied physics from MIT. I spent 3 years at DARPA developing advanced targeting systems for special operations, including the AIXM-C you're all shooting today. It hit like a detonation. Reynolds looked as though someone had just told him the sky wasn't real. Wilson stepped in. She's not here to qualify. She already ranks among the top 5 long-distance shooters in the military. She's here to evaluate the program and its instructors. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel. The drive back from Impossible Ridge was silent. Reynolds sat in the passenger seat of the Humvee, hands resting stiff on his thighs, eyes fixed on the terrain sliding past, the valley, the rise, the distant target. All of it was burned into his mind now, along with the fact that a woman he'd spent the day mocking had hit what he could not even touch. He hadn't said a word to Captain Wilson on the return trip. Not one, and Wilson hadn't asked. There was no point. At the platform, the others were still gathered when the vehicle rolled in. Their faces were a study in mixed emotions. Awe, suspicion, curiosity. Reynolds stepped out, avoiding every eye. Wilson walked directly to Hayes. Confirmed, perfect center mass. Hayes didn't look surprised. He didn't look anything, really. He just turned his attention to Avery, who stood with her rifle case at her side, boots planted as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. I think it's time you told us who you really are. She didn't answer immediately. The wind stirred her hair where it escaped the helmet strap, carrying the faint scent of rain from the oncoming storm. Then she said, almost conversationally, Captain Avery Mitchell, Ph.D., Applied Physics, MIT. For the past 3 years, I've been with DARPA, developing next-gen targeting systems for special operations, including the ballistic compensation system on the rifles you're using today. The air changed. You could almost feel the weight of the revelation sink into the deck beneath their boots. Reynolds' eyes locked on her, searching for something, disbelief, defiance, even mockery, that found only that steady, unreadable calm. Captain Wilson stepped forward. She wasn't here to earn a qualification. She already ranks in the top 5 long-distance shooters in the entire military. She was here to evaluate the course. And the instructors. The words dropped like rounds on a metal plate. Sharp. Final. It took a beat for the rest to process it. Garcia's gaze flicked between Wilson and Avery, as if trying to reconcile the quiet, solitary figure from that morning with the legend standing before them now. Davidson's mouth tightened. He wasn't smiling. Neither was anyone else. Hayes took a slow breath, then spoke, not to Avery, but to the entire group. This program exists to shape the best into something better. We claim to train without bias. We claim to measure by skill alone. Today, you've all been shown a mirror. Decide for yourselves what you see in it. Nobody moved. Reynolds' voice broke the stillness, low and strained. Sir, Avery turned to face him. There was no anger in her expression. No satisfaction either, just a quiet, measured assessment. Sergeant. Reynolds, your technical skills are impressive. Your leadership qualities. She paused, letting the silence speak for her. Need work. The military has no room for instructors who undermine qualified personnel because of personal bias. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. But it landed harder than any insult could have. The group shifted unconsciously. A subtle widening of the space around Reynolds. The storm broke over the far hills as they convoyed back to base camp. Fat raindrops splattered against windshields, hissing on the hot metal of the trucks. Inside, no one spoke. The sound of rain and the hum of engines filled the space where earlier there had been easy laughter and careless jabs. By the time they arrived, the camp lights had begun to glow against the steel-gray sky. The smell of wet earth and oil hung in the air. In the command center, Hayes, Wilson, and Avery sat at a metal table under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. A pot of coffee steamed between them. Untouched. I owe you an apology, Captain. Hayes said, his voice formal. Had I known your background, that's exactly why you weren't told. Commander, Avery said, her tone even. The evaluation required authentic reactions to a female candidate with no rank or reputation attached. Hayes' jaw worked for a moment. Then he nodded. Then we failed that test spectacularly. Parts of it, Avery agreed. Your technical training is excellent. The culture needs work. Wilson slid a folder across the table. Captain. Mitchell's full background. I think you'll find it illuminating. Hayes flipped it open, his eyes scanning quickly. Patents. Consultations with Tier 1 units. Development of advanced trajectory mapping systems. When he looked up, there was no doubt left in his eyes. Why maintain the charade all day? You could have identified yourself at any time. Avery leaned forward. Because in the field, no one cares about your credentials. Results are what matter. And the kind of bias and undermining I saw today can get people killed. Hayes didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with outside. Reynolds sat alone on a crate near the motor pool, the camp buzzing distantly behind him. His rifle rested across his lap, cleaned and cased, but untouched. His thoughts looped endlessly. The shot, her calm, the simple way she dismantled his authority without raising her voice. Garcia approached, hands in his pockets. Mess. All's open. Thought you might want to grab something with the team. Reynolds shook his head. Not in the mood for company. Garcia hesitated. Fair enough, for what it's worth. I think we all learned something today. Yeah, Reynolds said bitterly. Don't judge a book by its cover. Garcia's mouth quirked. More like, don't be an ass to anyone, because you never know who they really are. He walked away, leaving Reynolds alone with the truth. Back inside, Hayes closed Avery's file and set it down. Your shot today. 4-4-2-0 meters. Single round. That's beyond what we consider humanly possible. The limits we place on what's possible, Avery said softly, are often just failures of imagination. Or in this case, mathematics. Hayes exhaled. Will your report recommend shutting down the program? No, she said without hesitation. I'll recommend expanding it. with changes to instructor selection and training methodology. This program is too valuable to lose. It just needs correction. Relief softened the edges of Hayes' stern expression. Thank you, Captain. When the meeting ended, Avery stepped out into the cooler night air. The rain had passed, leaving the ground dark and wet, the scent of ozone lingering. She walked to the edge of the training ground. Letting her eyes sweep over the familiar ridges and valleys, Wilson joined her. You could have ended Reynolds' commentary hours ago, saved yourself some grief. She gave him a sidelong glance, and missed the look on his face when he realized who I was. Not a chance, Wilson chuckled. Fair, but why put yourself through it at all? You had nothing to prove. It wasn't about proving anything to myself, she said quietly. It was about documenting the experience. Every woman, every minority, every person who doesn't fit the mold. They face what I face today. The difference is they don't have captain's bars or a PhD to fall back on. They just get crushed by it until they quit. Wilson's voice was softer now. Your report's going to make waves. It should, she said. The best shooter I ever met was a 5'4" Filipino woman who could outshoot anyone in Delta Force. She quit because of this exact kind of treatment. How many more have we lost because we valued conformity over competence? They stood there for a moment, the camp alive behind them but feeling far away. And somewhere deep in the shadows, Reynolds sat alone, realizing that tomorrow would not be the end of this story. Not for him and not for her. Morning broke over Sniper Ridge like nothing had happened, as if the desert itself didn't care that an impossible shot had been made here the day before. The horizon glowed in bands of gold and amber. Heat still slept in the ground. The air was sharp with that rare, cool clarity that came before the sun claimed the day. But in the camp, something had changed. Word had spread. It wasn't just the snipers now. Instructors, staff, even junior personnel had drifted toward the range. Drawn by the story that had already begun to grow into legend, the rookie who wasn't a rookie, the impossible shot made in one, the humiliation of those who'd written her off. They formed up in rows along the firing line, boots striking the packed earth in unison. The entire cadre stood present. Even those who normally had no part in final day ceremonies were here. When Avery stepped from the barracks, it was not as the quiet, solitary figure of the day before. Her uniform was immaculate, captain's bars gleaming at her collar. Her boots, polished to a dark sheen, caught the rising light, and on her head. Not the helmet that had hidden her hair, but her regulation cover, tilted just enough to show the edge of the red beneath. The transformation was subtle, but it hit like a shift in gravity. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't playing the candidate, and every man who'd stood beside her in line yesterday knew it. The murmurs that had carried yesterday, jokes, rumors, dismissals, were gone. In their place, silence, the kind of silence born from respect. Or at the very least the awareness that respect was owed. Commander Hayes stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back. His voice carried without needing to rise. Yesterday, you witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a shot that defied the limits of range and probability, but a lesson in humility. A reminder that skill knows no gender, no background, no easy label. He let that settle before continuing. Captain Mitchell has completed her evaluation of our program. The Advanced Precision Marksmanship course will continue, with changes to ensure that skill, not bias, decides who stands here. A ripple of relief passed through the group. Despite its challenges, this program was a point of pride for those who had passed it. None wanted to see it dismantled. Hayes turned toward Avery. Captain, if you would. She stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. In the history of this facility, only 3 shooters have ever completed the 4-4-2-0 meter challenge. Yesterday, I became the 3rd. She opened the box. Inside, nestled in black felt, was a gold pin in the shape of a spotter's scope, the mark of the almost mythical achievement. She lifted it between her fingers, the metal catching the early sun. Hayes nodded. Captain Mitchell will now join our wall of legends. The applause that followed was not the sharp, perfunctory clapping of formality. It was measured, sustained, and from most genuine. Even those who had mocked her the day before now looked at her with something they hadn't before. Acknowledgement. When the sound faded, Hayes dismissed them. As the formation broke, men began gathering their gear, slinging rifles over their shoulders. Conversation stayed low, respectful. No one jostled. No one smirked. Reynolds approached from the edge of the crowd. His face was carefully neutral, but his posture was tight, the kind of stiffness that came when a man carried something heavy and didn't know how to set it down. He stopped 2 paces from her. Captain Mitchell, request permission to speak frankly. Granted, Sergeant. I behaved unprofessionally yesterday, he said, each word deliberate. My conduct was unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer. And an instructor, I formally apologize and accept whatever consequences you decide. Her eyes stayed on him for a long moment, not cold, not warm either, measuring. Your technical skills are exceptional, Sergeant. Your leadership skills need work. My report recommends you return to your unit for additional leadership training before resuming instructional duties. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe even relief. That's more than fair. Thank you, Captain. Don't thank me yet, she said evenly. The training I've recommended is intensive, and you'll be starting from zero in terms of credibility. Your future here will depend entirely on your ability to adapt and grow. I understand. Good. Dismissed, Sergeant. Reynolds gave a short nod and stepped back. From the sidelines, Wilson watched the exchange, stepping in as Reynolds moved away. That was generous, he said quietly. Avery's gaze followed Reynolds for a moment. He's a gifted shooter. The military's invested years into his training. Better to correct him than discard him. The question now is whether he decides to change. Wilson glanced at her. Some men do, some don't. That's his test, she said. Not mine. They walked together toward the command center, boots striking the damp earth in slow rhythm. The air was warming now, the sun cresting fully above the ridge. What's next for you? Wilson asked. Back to DARPA? Avery shook her head. Field deployment. I've spent too long in labs and testing ranges. Time to put the work to use. Any unit would be lucky to have you, Wilson said. She paused at the steps to the command center, looking back toward the range. The target hills lay in the distance, barely visible through the morning haze. You know the hardest part of yesterday? She asked. What's that? Deliberately missing those early, long-distance shots. I had to make it believable that I was just good enough to scrape by until the final test. Wilson chuckled. Your acting skills might rival your shooting inside. The wall of legends displayed framed photographs of the few who had achieved what most called impossible. By tomorrow, Avery's would join them, the first woman among their ranks in a few hours. She would finish her report by nightfall. She'd be on her way out, but the ripple she'd left here would remain in changed attitudes, in altered training, in the quiet knowledge that underestimating someone could be a dangerous mistake. Outside, the range lay quiet now, empty of its shooters, but the echo of that single shot, the one that had traveled 4,420 meters, still seemed to hang in the air. It was more than a shot. It was proof, and proof, once seen, can't be unseen. The command center was quieter than usual. The constant hum of radios, the shuffle of boots, the low murmur of voices, all of it seemed dialed down, as if the building itself was waiting to hear what came next. Avery stepped inside, saluted Hayes, and took her seat across from him. Captain Wilson was already there, leaning back slightly, a mug of coffee in his hand. On the table between them sat her open file, a fresh notepad, and a printed sheet of the previous day's qualification. Scores. Hayes didn't waste time. Captain Mitchell. Your report. She placed a thick folder on the table, the pages inside neatly tabbed and marked. Technical Review, page 1 through 38. Cultural Assessment, 39 through 52. Recommendations, 53 through 60. Hayes flipped through it briefly, eyes scanning faster than he could possibly absorb. He looked up. And your conclusion? Avery met his gaze. The program's technical framework is solid. Your range work, your environmental simulation, your weapons maintenance protocols, all strong. But the culture? She paused. It undermines itself. The bias is casual, but pervasive. It's costing you talent before it can even prove itself. Hayes leaned back, his chair creaking. You think it's that bad? I know it is, Avery said evenly. What happened yesterday wasn't unique to me. I just had the credentials to weather it. Someone else, someone without rank or a reputation, would have been ground down until they quit. And when that happens, you don't just lose a person. You lose everything they could have brought to the fight. Wilson nodded faintly, but didn't speak. Hayes rubbed his jaw, silent for a moment. Sergeant Reynolds. My recommendation is reassignment to a non-instructional role until he completes leadership remediation, Avery said. He's a skilled marksman, but skill without leadership is just ego with a trigger. There was no malice in her tone, just fact. The conversation shifted. Hayes wanted specifics, new criteria for instructor selection, a formalized feedback system, mentorship pairing between seasoned and incoming candidates. Avery laid it out. Each suggestion grounded in both her technical expertise and the human reality she'd witnessed. When she finished, Hayes closed the folder. This will make waves, he said. It should, she replied. The military can't afford to keep losing good shooters to bad leadership. His gaze lingered on her. I'll be honest, Captain. You could have come in here with your rank visible, your credentials on display. They'd have treated you differently, maybe too differently to get an honest read on them. But you chose to walk in as the underdog. That's the only way to see people's real character, she said. Put them under pressure and see how they treat the person they think can't fight back. Hayes nodded slowly. And what did you learn? That bias is predictable, she said quietly. But so is respect, if you force them to see you. When the meeting ended, Avery stepped outside. The storm that had skirted the valley the day before was gone now, leaving the air washed clean. The ridges looked sharper in the morning light, the horizon stretching in layered tones of sand and rust. She walked past the motor pool, where a few mechanics were leaning on toolboxes, talking in low voices. Conversation stopped when she passed, not in the cold way it had stopped yesterday. This was different. Eyes followed her, but no one laughed. No one whispered. By the range, Garcia was checking his rifle. He straightened when he saw her. Captain, he said, with a nod that carried more weight than the word itself. Avery returned it with the faintest smile and kept walking. She found a quiet spot on the far edge of camp where the view opened wide over the valley. The same valley her bullet had crossed in 9 impossible seconds. The same valley that had shifted something in every man who'd watched. Wilson joined her a few minutes later, hands in his pockets. You leave tonight? Transport's at 1900, she said. He glanced toward the range. Reynolds has been keeping to himself. He's got his own work to do now. Wilson hesitated, then asked, You think he'll make it? I think he can, she said. Whether he will, that's on him. For a moment they stood in silence, listening to the faint clatter of metal from the range, the distant whine of a generator. You know, Wilson said, they'll tell this story for years, the day a rookie hit the impossible shot. That's fine, Avery said. Let them tell it however they need to. The point isn't my name. The point is the next time someone sees a candidate who doesn't fit their picture, they'll think twice before writing them off. You believe it'll stick? She looked at the far ridge, the place where her target had stood in the shimmer of heat. It has to. That night, she would leave Sniper Ridge. By then, her photograph would already be on the wall of legends, alongside the two others who had made that shot. But the plaque wouldn't say what mattered most. It wouldn't say that she'd come here not to prove her aim, but to measure something harder to calculate, the gap between what people claim to value and what they actually respect. And as she stood there, the desert breathing quietly around her, she knew the gap had been exposed. Whether they chose to close, it was no longer her mission. The road out of Sniper Ridge cut through a landscape that seemed endless. The desert stretched in muted colors, the pale gold of sand, the rust of rock, the deepening shadows of the ridgelines. The transport's suspension groaned over the uneven ground, each dip and rise a small reminder that she was leaving the heat and grip behind. Inside, the truck was dim. The red glow from the instrument panel bathed the space in a muted light. The men seated near the front spoke quietly among themselves. No one disturbed her. Avery sat with her rifle case leaning against her leg, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Outwardly, she looked at ease. Inside, her mind was already shifting. Forward, to the next posting, the next test, the next place she'd have to navigate both the mission and the people. She thought about the moment the shot had landed. Not the praise that followed, not the shock on their faces, but the silence. In those 9 seconds between pulling the trigger and hearing the confirmation, 9 seconds where nothing else existed but her breathing, her heartbeat, and the arc of a bullet, carving through heat and wind and gravity towards something the world said was too far. 9 seconds of knowing she had done the math right. She had known, even before the spotter's voice came over the radio, that the target was hit. Not because of ego, not because she needed it to be true, but because she trusted her process, her preparation, her discipline, and maybe that was the point. At the base of the next ridge, the truck slowed for a checkpoint. A floodlight washed the interior in white for a moment, catching the gold edge of her captain's bars, the clean lines of her uniform, the calm in her eyes. The sentry waved them through. When the light fell away, the darkness returned. But her mind stayed on what had been said in the command center earlier that day. Bias is predictable, she told Hayes, but so is respect. If you force them to see you, it wasn't the first time she'd had to force someone to see her. It wouldn't be the last, but yesterday had been different. Yesterday, she had made them see not just her, but the flaw in themselves, whether they did anything with that knowledge. Well, that was out of her hands now. Miles behind her at Sniper Ridge, the evening settled in. The wall of legends inside the command center now held a new photograph, her face captured mid-focus, scope raised, hair tucked neatly back underneath. The small gold plate bore her name and the words 4,420 meters. First attempt. Reynolds had stood in front of that wall earlier, staring at the photo longer than he probably realized. No one had spoken to him. No one needed to. He wasn't the same man who had made those cutting remarks in the morning briefing. Whether the change would last, that was his choice. Garcia had walked past and paused beside him. "Hell of a shot," he'd said simply. Reynolds hadn't answered, but the nod he gave was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, something had settled differently inside him. The truck's tires hummed against asphalt now. They were nearing the airfield. Avery could hear the low whine of a distant generator, the occasional metallic clang of a toolbox dropped on concrete. Wilson was waiting there. She knew he would be. He was leaning against the railing near the loading ramp, clipboard under his arm. As the truck came to a stop, he straightened, meeting her gaze through the open ramp. When she stepped down, he gave a faint smile. "You travel light. Easier to keep moving," she said. "You'll keep in touch?" She gave him a look that was half amused, half serious. "You'll read my reports." He shook his head with a small laugh. "Not the same." She shouldered her kit and walked toward the waiting aircraft at the foot of the boarding stairs. She paused for one last look back. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel. The sky a deep indigo, where the last of the sun had vanished. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Sniper Ridge sat under the same stars, the wind sweeping over its platforms, carrying the echoes of the day she had turned their certainty inside out. She thought about all the people who would never know her name, but would feel the effects of what had happened. The instructors who might second-guess their own words. The candidates who might find themselves judged by skill instead of assumption. The shot had been precise, the math flawless, but its real trajectory was still playing out. When she reached the top of the stairs, she didn't look back again, because it wasn't her place to stay and make them remember. It was their place to carry it forward, and that, she thought, was the real lesson. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The road out of Sniper Ridge cut through a landscape that seemed endless. The desert stretched in muted colors, the pale gold of sand, the rust of rock, the deepening shadows of the ridgelines. The transport's suspension groaned over the uneven ground, each dip and rise a small reminder that she was leaving the heat and grip behind. Inside, the truck was dim. The red glow from the instrument panel bathed the space in a muted light. The men seated near the front spoke quietly among themselves. No one disturbed her. Avery sat with her rifle case leaning against her leg, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Outwardly, she looked at ease. Inside, her mind was already shifting. Forward, to the next posting, the next test, the next place she'd have to navigate both the mission and the people. She thought about the moment the shot had landed. Not the praise that followed, not the shock on their faces, but the silence. In those 9 seconds between pulling the trigger and hearing the confirmation, 9 seconds where nothing else existed but her breathing, her heartbeat, and the arc of a bullet, carving through heat and wind and gravity towards something the world said was too far. 9 seconds of knowing she had done the math, right? She had. Known, even before the spotter's voice came over the radio, that the target was hit. Not because of ego, not because she needed it to be true, but because she trusted her process, her preparation, her discipline, and maybe that was the point. At the base of the next ridge, the truck slowed for a checkpoint. A floodlight washed the interior in white for a moment, catching the gold edge of her captain's bars, the clean lines of her uniform, the calm in her eyes. The sentry waved them through. When the light fell away, the darkness returned. But her mind stayed on what had been said in the command center earlier that day. Bias is predictable, she told Hayes, but so is respect. If you force them to see you, it wasn't the first time she'd had to force someone to see her. It wouldn't be the last, but yesterday had been different. Yesterday, she had made them see not just her, but the flaw in themselves, whether they did anything with that knowledge. Well, that was out of her hands now, miles behind her at Sniper Ridge. The evening settled in. The wall of legends inside the command center now held a new photograph, her face captured mid-focus, scope raised, hair tucked neatly back underneath. The small gold plate bore her name and the words 4,420 meters. First attempt. Reynolds had stood in front of that wall earlier, staring at the photo longer than he probably realized. No one had spoken to him. No one needed to. He wasn't the same man who had made those cutting remarks in the morning briefing. Whether the change would last, that was his choice. Garcia had walked past and paused beside him. "Hell of a shot," he'd said simply. Reynolds hadn't answered, but the nod he gave was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, something had settled differently inside him. The truck's tires hummed against asphalt now. They were nearing the airfield. Avery could hear the low whine of a distant generator, the occasional metallic clang of a toolbox dropped on concrete. Wilson was waiting there. She knew he would be. He was leaning against the railing near the loading ramp, clipboard under his arm. As the truck came to a stop, he straightened, meeting her gaze through the open ramp. When she stepped down, he gave a faint smile. "You travel light. Easier to keep moving," she said. "You'll keep in touch?" She gave him a look that was half amused, half serious. "You'll read my reports." He shook his head with a small laugh. "Not the same." She shouldered her kit and walked toward the waiting aircraft at the foot of the boarding stairs. She paused for one last look back. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel. The sky a deep indigo where the last of the sun had vanished. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Sniper Ridge sat under the same stars, the wind sweeping over its platforms, carrying the echoes of the day she had turned their certainty inside out. She thought about all the people who would never know her name, but would feel the effects of what had happened. The instructors who might second-guess their own words. The candidates who might find themselves judged by skill instead of assumption. The shot had been precise, the math flawless, but its real trajectory was still playing out. When she reached the top of the stairs, she didn't look back again, because it wasn't her place to stay and make them remember. It was their place to carry it forward, and that, she thought, was the real lesson. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.